I think it'll be a good idea to ask Sharan to maybe just give a brief summary of what the book is before we delve deeper into the content.
Okay, so the book is basically based on the Ramayana. It doesn't take all the events in the epic, it just looks at specific events within the epic and is told through the eyes of a spy from Lanka. So the narrator of the book is a spy, and his paths sort of cross with Rama's at various points in Rama's life. And at some point in the book, it also becomes about the spy himself. And the spy grows up in war-torn Lanka, and it's his background and how he grows up, and what happens to the two of them, to Rama and the spy, and how they sort of interact with each other, and how they sort of come to influence each other, and how they sort of arrive at their own understanding of the idea of dharma, goodness, justice, love, and friendship. So that's what the book is about.
And the spy's name is?
So the spy is called Reddu Mone. Reddu Mone is the name of the spy. Reddu is two in this language, Tulu, which is where I grew up on the coast in Karnataka. And Tulu is one of the languages used there. So Reddu is two and Mone is face. So it's literally two-face.
So given that most of the books in the market, and India has seen this kind of boom in publishing, and most of the books that come from, say, your generation tend to be about their IIT days and their kind of first romances and heartbreak. What made you choose, Indian mythology and Ramayana in particular?
No, to be honest, I've written my own share of random fiction about my days in college, which I'm very happy I never did anything with. No, I think the two things here. One is my own personal story. I sort of was first introduced to alternative perspectives in the Ramayana when I was in college. I did a course in English. Where I was in Delhi University, and I came across Chandrapati's Ramayana, which is a very feminist perspective of the Ramayana. It's told through the eyes of Chandrapati, who actually narrates it like Sita. So it's Sita's version of the epic, and sort of takes a very harsh view of Rama. And it sort of intrigued me that you could look at the epic from different perspectives and sort of offer other ways of narrating the epic. I also did write a few short stories, like one series of short stories from the perspective of a person on the Sentry Tower of Ayodhya. So it was on Sita's banishment. I think I was influenced by Chandrapati's Ramayana, and therefore I also thought of looking at the one event where Rama is sort of not shown in the best of light, and I sort of narrated through the eyes of a person on the Sentry Tower of Ayodhya. What I found was it wasn't writing it. I liked writing it, but I also found that a person on the Sentry Tower of Ayodhya can't really see much. All he can do is talk to people around him, but he won't get to see he won't get to see the palace or any of the inside stories. So, and that's why the spy sort of came about in some ways. The spy is more a narrative device than anything else. A spy can be everywhere. And the idea of writing it through the eyes of the spy was basically to make it easy for me to go to, you could sort of sneak in on important discussions between ministers and kings and into bedrooms of people. You could do what you wanted. And so that's how the book came about. On mythology in general, if you notice, other than people writing about college romances, there's a lot of now young people who've gone to IITs and IIMs writing about mythology itself. There's the Shiva trilogy. There's something about Ravana that's come out, and there are a whole bunch of books in that. And I think that though I wasn't influenced by that writing, I think it really helped publishers to see my book, to at least get to look at the book. Whether or not they accepted it because it was in that genre, it at least sort of gave my book a point of entry into the world of these publishers. So, yeah.
And when you were writing it, over the months and years, in fact, right, that you've spent writing it, how did you...
have the book here with you. I'll just read out the page number so that it's page 51, and it starts off at the very end of the page. So if you have the book with you, then I'll just read out a couple of pages. So it'll take about 4 minutes. Okay. Okay, I'm going to start. The very last line in page, the last paragraph in page 51. Kill me, says Shatrughna, his voice soft. Come back with me, Rama says. His voice is still harsh, though no longer wild. The manic but precise arrow work has served as an outlet for Rama's rage. He holds his bow casually now. He's no longer stiff. Why, brother? Why do you want me back so desperately? Because I care for all those people you will hurt by your actions, and because what you intend to do is wrong, adharma. If I can help it, I will not let even a crow in my kingdom stray from the path of righteousness. Can't you see we abide by different dharmas? That I am as comfortable with being a kshatriya as a deer is among the lions. Dharma is not what you're born with, it's what you choose. If everyone chose their own dharma, there would be chaos. Society would break down. Rama's voice has regained much of its usual serenity. There would be freedom, joy, Shatrughna says. Chaotic happiness is always short-lived, Rama responds. The rain has all but stopped. Water droplets trickle down branches and leaves, glisten like pearls on the grass. Brother, Shatrughna says eventually, and pauses, weighing his words. I am not asking for a change in society's order. Let it do as it pleases. Just let me do as I please. Rama sighs, and when he speaks, his words echo. The trees are chanting. Dharma is the reason I exist. He fires an arrow at Shatrughna's legs. It curves against the wind and cuts through his previous arrow. Shatrughna's legs are dangling free. Shatrughna has just been pinned to a tree with Rama's arrows. So, Dharma is the source of my strength, Rama says. Another arrow is fired and his right hand is free. Just one arrow carries all of Shatrughna's weight, still pinning him to the bark. Dharma gives my near complete control over my senses. One final arrow and Shatrughna is released, his gold bracelets broken, his loincloth slightly torn. Dharma is what gives me such tremendous respect. To be seen to have a brother like you does me no good. Shatrughna stands free, his lanky silhouette, uncertain in the darkness, not knowing what lies in store now. Rama, however, looks wary. His eyes, speaking slowly, he says, speaking slowly, I've tried to appeal to your emotional side. When that failed, I tried to reason with you. When that failed, I chose force. I finally even explained my conception of dharma. Now I've played all my cards. The choice is yours. With that, he turns to me and says softly, maybe even kindly, come. We turn around, Rama and I, and walk back. I look back at Shatrughna for what is the last time. He stands drenched, motionless in the darkness, his head held low, his arms folded. His ornate bow lies unused on the grass, surrounded by polished arrows that are strewn about, their tips shining silver in the moonlight. I am overcome by a tremendous sadness. We trudge back. Rama stays by me, but doesn't look back. He whistles tunelessly. The forest is tranquil, punctuated by the sounds of trees shaking themselves dry, of water droplets rolling down their branches and leaves. Rama's eyes are inscrutable, his walk majestic. Eventually the whistling stops. He looks up at the sky, then at me and says, he'll come back. Don't worry. The skies are changing again. A single vein of red shoots through it like an ink stain. The stars are winding up their show. The pale moon slinks into the background. The birds can barely contain their excitement. The slow wind feels fresh. The earth new. Soon it is dawn.
A fair amount of the book is around this kind of impossible ideal of dharma, whether it's Rama's or whether it's Redumone the spy. Can you talk a bit more about each one of their dharma and how they change over time and over the span of your novel?
So I think Rama's idea of dharma is sort of more in line with what was then seen as the conventional understanding of what the term means, which is that you follow a set of tenets and norms that sort of keep not only you in order, but your society itself. And you follow those rules because they are the right rules. And that's how he starts off. It, of course, as the passage I read out shows, it also gives him a lot of strength, both moral and something that's intangible, that's more than moral. And it sort of gives him the otherworldly persona that he sort of exudes throughout the book. But eventually he also understands that, that dharma is not just, sticking to the rules. It's also about being human. And I think the book in many ways is an attempt to try and humanize Rama, but also humanize the emotions that everyone else is going through in the epic itself. And Redumone, on the other hand, is someone who starts off as a spy. And as he says somewhere in the book, spies are the type of people who make bonds with the explicit intention of breaking them. You make friends and then you just leave. And Redumone sort of grows into, who sort of therefore is always a little distant. If Rama is distant because he sees the world through his dharma, Redumone is distant because he sees the world through his occupation, which is being a spy. And eventually he moves on as the book goes on and as events sort of force him to look at the world differently. He moves on to seeing things in a way similar to what Rama eventually sort of accepts, which is seeing the world in a more human way. And sort of the book is in many ways a book that sort of sings pains to the very ideal utopian notions of love, justice, kindness, generosity, and and I think they both sort of move towards being more human, and that's how it perceives dharma.
One thing in kind of the mainstream Ramayana that we grew up in as kids, even in the Amar Chitra Katha, right, comics, and also in Blue, I find, is that Rama is portrayed as so good and so magnificent that it's actually a bit exhausting. So were you ever tempted to have him falter a bit more and show a bit more kind of humanity in that?
So that's an interesting question, because I find that very often when you're retelling an epic, say for example the Mahabharata, with every retelling the character of Karna or Radheya to some of you becomes nicer and nicer, and his flaws are sort of slowly being chipped away at, and by I have a feeling in about 100 years he'll become the most perfect hero you can ever imagine. And the same has been done recently with Ravana, where now suddenly people have discovered that he was half Brahmin, he was a scholar, he's a king, and he's done so much good. So there's a lot of rescuing of bad guys in some ways, and putting down of good guys. And this has happened across centuries. It's not a new thing, but I think with Indian writing in English right now, that's been a trend. What I wanted to do with Rama was not, of course, he's still a little bit more than human, a little bit more than a normal man in the book too. He's got, in some ways he's telepathic, but he's not explained, and he definitely knows more than the average person. He's a little bit of a genius. But in many ways, like the whole Dharma incident I read out, he's definitely deeply flawed and still sort of coming to understand with his own perfect nature in some ways and the way the world perceives him. I think I definitely don't think I paint Rama as the most ideal human being in the world, but I also paint him like the person that we all aspire to be. I think somewhere in the book, towards the end, one of the characters says this. He says, Rama is no god, but he makes gods look obsolete. And that's the kind of idea I was trying to look at. So I didn't try to sort of paint him in a completely bad light, but also to not take away what the epic sees him as. And I thought it was important to keep that flavor. But no, I never toyed with the idea of changing his character.
That reminds me, a favorite part of mine in the book is towards the end, where it's book 4 and it's called Somewhere Central. And there's this one scene where there's a little boy who's looking up at this statue that's been built. And the statue is magnificent and it has wings and just very, very inspiring. And then a person comes up behind him and he says, "Incredible statue, is this your god?" And it turns out it's Rama who's asking the boy who the statue is of. And so I thought that was to what you said about this whole Rama Katha and the fictionalization that takes place. We've talked a lot about Rama. How about now talking about the other side, which is Redumone? Could you say a bit more, and then maybe we can read a passage as well that shows a bit of Redumone, either his history or his interaction with Lakshman?
So I think I've told you some bit about the spy. The spy was basically a very easy narrative device, but I think halfway into writing the book, I sort of really fell in love with the character of the spy, and because I wrote it over a long time, I wrote it over a year and more, I would have these intense phases of writing and then these phases of non-writing. And I think in some ways it was good, because when I was really writing seriously, I felt like I started thinking like the spy. And every observation was something that you have to file away in your head and say, this is how he would see it. And that became troublesome. So it was nice to sort of, to draw a cricketing metaphor, take a single and sort of be at the non-strikers end for a bit and focus on your work that you do in your daily life. And so the book also sort of reflects that, in the sense that the way I wrote it, the book has 4 parts, and I wrote the first part and the third part, which is largely about Rama and the characters in the Ramayana. And then I wrote the second and the fourth, which is about the spy and some peripheral events that happen around him. So, in many ways, it sort of reflects how I sort of was drawn into his character and started really falling in love with him almost as much as I liked the character of Rama. So I'll read a short passage with the spy's interaction with Lakshmana. This comes in the part of the chunk of the book that's called Kishkinda. So it's where the book itself addresses the killing of Vali and the whole moral dilemma and the whole debates around it. But this part that I'm going to read out is Lakshmana sort of grieving for his loss. He's feeling bad that Sita has been stolen away. And the spy is an old friend of Lakshmana's because he's seen him when he was a kid. Not a kid, but he was a late teenager, early 20s, an impressionable young youth, and he's seen him again in Kishkinda. So they have a sort of a bond between them, a nice warm friendship between them. And this is a conversation between the two of them about loss and grieving and life and all those large questions. Okay, so this is page 140. I'm going to go straight into the conversation. So it's the end of the page. So page 140, the very end of that page. Okay, I'm going to start. Good evening, I say. I hear as a spy. Good evening, I say. He doesn't reply. His smile giving way to what is now his staple expression. Eyebrows knit in anger. Face held stiff. Lip drooping. I like the rain, I say, attempting to make conversation. There's nothing quite as refreshing as a thunderous shower. Lakshmana is still quiet, his countenance showing no indication that my words have registered. Slowly, perceptibly, his taut forehead relaxes, his lips part, he smirks and asks, "You know what the rain reminds me of?" I wait for him to answer the question. Life, the pointlessness of it all. Look at these raindrops charging from the skies with mad passion, only to be stopped pitilessly by an impassive earth. And look at us, races of humans and other creatures, marching through life with so much purpose, only for death to consume us all. As I laugh at these foolish raindrops, someone else will laugh at me. I mull over what he says and rally with what strikes me as perhaps the only cheery thing to say. The point of life is in the march. He cringes, but doesn't retort immediately. He then asks, but it is a question that is not to be answered. What happens when the life is sucked out of your march? Instantly, I picture a downpour suddenly halted. Infinite silver raindrops stay suspended in midair, and the rays of a bright midday sun stream through, splitting into 1,000 rainbows. It could be beautiful, I want to say. Instead, I simply look at him. In the 15 years since I last saw him, he has aged considerably. His face is harder, more creased, his voice is deeper, and there are tinges of grey in his sideburns. Age descends imperiously on some, changing their features for the worse. In Lakshmana, it arrived from within. It has made him look exceedingly desirable. Yes, it could just be very beautiful. I don't get it, Lakshmana eventually says heavily, turning to me. His eyes are bloodshot, sleep-deprived. Years of experience has taught me the power of well-timed silences. How can brother be so calm? Here I am, torn to shreds by terrible unfair loss, furious, bitter. But nowadays, Rama simply sits serenely, like he's almost waiting for her to magically reappear. His voice betrays a faint quiver, but his body is still. He waits for me to speak, and I reply, choosing my words carefully. Lakshmana, I do not know if you know, but Rama and I spoke for a long while about Sita. Rama is just as anguished as he was in those early days of loss, when he only railed and raved. But he also recognizes that the time for grief is brief, that now, more than ever, he needs to muster all the courage he can and stay focused. The rain grows heavier. I can barely hear myself over the din of the downpour. Lakshmana, however, replies softly, but the depth of his voice easily sails over the rain. If there's one virtue, he says, my brother has that I cannot stand and can never have myself. It is patience. A remarkable statement from a prince who has spent the past 14 years of his life in the forests, away from his family, devoid of any company, but for his brother and his wife.
So there are parts of the Ramayana that you've either fleetingly referred to or you skip, like the Aranya Kanda and then the Yuddha Kanda, right? Were you I mean, and also in this part, at least the audience gets a sense of Lakshmana and what he's feeling and going through. But were you ever tempted to choose kind of to go more deeply into Lakshmana's character, or to look at kind of the searing part where Sita's purity is questioned, or do you think those are future books to come?
No, I wasn't really tempted because, to be honest, I didn't write it like one book. I sort of wrote it in a serialized way, and when I wrote it, I was just picking out incidents that I thought would be interesting to write about in the Ramayana. And I sort of tried to pick on either things that were completely unexplored, like what were these brothers like before they became Rama and Lakshmana and Sita and all these great human beings. What were they before what was the making of these people like? And the other was the Wali incident. I think a lot of people have written about it. It's a very controversial incident. The only other, there are two other, like you pointed out, there are two other incidents that you can sort of pick and write about and sort of, complicate in some ways. Which the one is Surpanaka and the way she was treated. I think a lot of feminist perspectives on the epic come out heavily in favor of Surpanaka and say that, she was very badly treated. And the other is the banishing of Sita. I'd already written a bit about the banishing of Sita, and I sort of, because I'd already heard of so many versions of those events, I didn't want to sort of go back and look at it. As for other parts of the epic that I want to write about, as of now I don't, but I think the Ramayana is a great epic to write about, because if you look at the Mahabharata, it's such a complex epic that, if you add something to it, you're only going to complicate something that's already really complex. It's a beautifully crafted epic. It's full of complexities, gray areas, shades of things that you can never imagine. The Ramayana is more about the writing. The original Valmiki epic, some of which I read in school, is just beautiful poetry. But the narrative itself, the story itself is much simpler. It's almost like your average Bollywood movies of the 80s. You have a hero, you have a villain. The villain kidnaps the heroine, and then the hero goes and rescues her. And of course there are some, and you can literally pick out the incidents where there are some shades of gray and that you can work with. But it really doesn't give you the kind of clay that you can work with, and some writers might find that a problem. I found it very good because I could now take out all the things in black and white and sort of pick the ones I want and work with them. So, yeah, I think it's a great epic to write about, but I don't know if I'll write again about it. So, let's see.
And then for my last question, before we open it up to the audience, I think we should kind of wrap up by going back to Redumone and thinking about him and talking about him. Can you, one of the interesting things I found in this is when you're writing in this kind of historical perspective, it's not just the language and the plot, but it's also the culture, the economics, the languages that were spoken then. And you spend a fair amount of time, perhaps because as an economist, on the economy of things, whether it's Lanka or whether it's Kishkinda. So can you talk a little bit about kind of, was there research that you did or just kind of thinking about it, and also how you thought about Redumone's growing up in Lanka and that background that he comes from?
On the economics thing, one of the things actually is quite funny you mentioned it, because one of my friends read the book, a friend's friend actually, who's also had some connections with publishers and stuff. So I sent it to that person, and I got a response saying there's too much economics in the book, and I don't understand half of what's going on. And I was shocked, because I really don't think, again, maybe you're not the right person because you're trained in economics too, but I don't think there's that much jargon in the book, and everything I've used is sort of try to weave it into the narrative of the story and not sort of impose just to sort of sound smart, put in words that no one else knows. But the idea was, so that's the economics. On languages, I think I grew up in Manipal, where a lot of languages are spoken. We were sort of a mix. We spoke a mix of Tamil and Telugu at home. My mother speaks a mix of Tamil and Malayalam. In fact, now we don't know what she speaks because she has Kannada thrown into many of her Tamil phrases. And we grew up in Karnataka, so Kannada was the language, but we also had Tulu, from where Redumone, the name, comes from, and then there's Konkani. So, there's so many languages, and then we learned Hindi, and we were also taught Sanskrit both in school and outside. So language has always been a little bit of an interest, and I did consider doing something like history or literature for my bachelor's, but I was told very strongly that there's no future in either. So I don't regret what I did, so I'm very happy I did economics. So, but And I sort of try to put that in the book. So you put those things that you repress into things that you can, in your outlets. And this was an outlet. So I sort of try and put those things in. Yeah, so some things are pretty obvious when I look at it in hindsight. Why would Redumone grow up in war-torn Lanka? Because there had to be something. The second part of the book is a little indulgent in some ways, at least the way when I read it now I feel, because it's a lot of writing and nothing really else is happening. And I had to sort of put in some kind of a plot in it. So then I said, okay, let there be a war and let Ravana, and I looked at events within the Ramayana, and Ravana invades Kubera's lands and steals money. So I sort of put that into the epic. But then I made the causes very strictly economic. So it was a matter of beautification of the capital, and I brought it in, and because it was very obvious to me. And now looking back, yeah, the public policy may play a role in how I thought about those events. But I also sort of made Kumbhakarna a little more economically wise than he's made out to be in the epic. And Redumone growing up, the good thing about Redumone in some ways was he's, at least as a child when he's growing up, he's sort of so blissfully unaware about everything that happens around him. It's almost like the kind of kid who's always perpetually lost, but if you read about him in a book, you want to pull his cheek. He's that completely self-absorbed, strange kid when he's growing up, and I had a lot of fun writing about it. Again, maybe a repressed side, I don't know. I was a pretty social kid. But yeah, so that's about Redumone and economics and language and sort of bringing all of them together in the book.
So let's now open this up to the audience and see if there are any questions from you.
It's working.
Yeah. How many Ramayans have you referred before writing this book?
So that's a question I get asked quite often, actually. So my answer seems rehearsed. Please excuse me. I sort of started as kids. You all grow up. Ramayana is sort of the thing that's sort of part of your cultural upbringing. You hear tales from your parents and stuff. But my first big book that I remember reading was Kamala Subramaniam's Mahabharata. And when I really liked it, when I was about 10 or 12, my father bought me the Kamala Subramaniam's Ramayana. So Kamala Subramaniam herself has written the Ramayana. And that was my first. It's sort of really comprehensive. It's a book that's about 3 times in size and about 800 pages thick. And I remember reading it from cover to cover and not being very impressed with it because I thought the Mahabharata was a far better epic. But that was the first Ramayana I had read. And then subsequently, of course, there's the Rajagopalachari, which is staple reading, and a bunch of others. We read Ramayana in school. We read Ramayana in Sanskrit in Kannada. And but the one book that I would like to talk about that I think some of you in the audience may know because it's a fantastic bunch of lectures. It's by the Srinivas Shastri, who's a fantastic scholar who's not written the Ramayana himself, but what he's gone on to do is to talk about every single character in the epic and analyze them. So he sort of referred to 1,000 sources and looked at every character, and he presents them in such different light that you really want to keep going back to those books. And that was a book that really influenced the way I thought about some of the characters. In fact, I don't think it's a matter of coincidence that some of my characters, the way he thinks about them, and he not only looks at people, but he also looks at events. So there are events that he looks at, and he looks at Puranas and how the Puranas look at some events, and why Rama acted in a particular. He comes up with reasons not only from, but from sources that times. So I'd like to talk about, but I've read a lot of Ramayanas. I think a lot of us read Ramayana. So.
It's mind blowing. 2 more questions. What's your age? Are you married? He's talking so good about Ramayana. And are you married?
I am 25 and I'm not married.
You have categorized as good guys and bad guys, and you said there is a trend in humanizing bad guys and demonizing good guys. But for example, if you see there is these Dalit intellectuals have certain criticism about Rama's actions, whether it in terms of Shurpanakha or some other person. And in Sri Lanka, they have a temple for Ravana. So is there a window for other perspective or it's closed?
I think in some ways the window never closes for alternate perspectives. You can always reinterpret. You always will find something new to say. On the humanizing of Ravana, during the Chennai launch, I was talking to someone after the launch, and they were telling me about how the non-Brahmin movement in Tamil Nadu, a lot of them named their kids Ravanan because they felt like he was against oppression. But what's funny is Ravana himself is a Brahmin, and so it was sort of slightly ironical that they chose him as their idol. And Rama was a Kshatriya. Rama was not a Brahmin himself. It was an interesting story someone told me. So there's always perspectives. You can always look at things in a different light. And I don't think the window ever closes. And if anything, I hope this book sort of makes the window slightly wider. You don't want to close windows with books. You want to open even more. So, and that's the hope.
While you considered Redumone as a spy, did you consider any alternate career for him? Did you consider looking at it from point of view of a foot soldier or something else like that? Why did you choose on a spy?
So this first reason of the spy is it's just easy for the spy to be everywhere, and that was one reason. Did I consider him as being anything else at all? See, I think at some point you get bored of writing in one perspective. So with the spy, by the third book, I'm done with writing from the eyes of the spy, and you have multiple narrators in this book itself. The fourth part, there are many voices talking, and one of the reasons was that it was also part of the plot because I didn't want to give away what happens to either of the spy or Rama, because at the end of the third book they sort of reach some kind of a tipping point, and rather than exploit that at that point, I just thought it will be more interesting to sort of let it hang there and then sort of reboot in some ways, and then tell the story, continue the story, but through multiple voices. So rather than make Redumone a foot soldier or this one, I simply had multiple voices narrating the epic. Again, one of the things that people told me was all those voices that talk about sound similar. So to sort of overcome that, I said they were all influenced by Redumone himself in some ways or the other, and therefore, they have a similar voice. But yeah, so that's what I did.
The plot seems very interesting, Sharan. Plot seems very interesting. Are you looking at getting it filmed?
It's interesting you ask it for two reasons. First, when I got the contract from HarperCollins about the book, there were these lots of clauses, and one of the clauses was about film rights and serial rights and stuff like that. And I really, if you're young or even if you're old and you're getting your first book offer, the last thing you care about clauses are. But I'm a lawyer, and he immediately said, keep the film rights and the serial rights. Don't give it to anyone. And at that point, it sounded like such a stupid thing. Not a stupid, but like a very trivial detail, because you're on a different plane at that point. Now in hindsight, it turned to be a really wise choice, because I keep getting people telling me that it should be made into a movie, and there are people who are interested who want to talk to you. But I don't know if anything will come out of all this. But it is interesting for sure.
What next?
Right now, I'm just going off for a PhD, so I'm going for a 5-year program, and apparently the first 2 years are going to be fairly rigorous. So because it's your coursework and stuff like that, because this book was written at a time when I was doing field work, and I spent a lot of time doing work in the day, and I was writing in the night. I'm hoping the pressure of the coursework in the day will spur me to write some more, because I find that when I have a lot of time on my hands, I'm not doing much writing. So the hope is that there will be more books, maybe non-fiction next, because I was in Bihar and I had a lot of stuff on Bihar then, so I don't know, maybe.
So you talked a lot about dharma and purpose. So how much of it is influenced from Ramayana and Mahabharata, the epics themselves, and what other influences have you had?
So one of the influences when I was reading the book was I was reading Amartya Sen's Idea of Justice, and same debates, and sort of in fact, many of the debates in the book are sort of reflected in any book on justice or any book on dharma that you come across. But he sort of provides a more human perspective to all these debates, and I think I was sort of influenced definitely by how he addressed them, if not necessarily by what standpoints he took. But being a liberal sort of person myself, with I think once you do an education that is not necessarily based in the sciences, you tend to be a little left-leaning and liberal. And given that, I'm sure the final, even if they don't start off from my understanding of dharma or my understanding of what righteousness should be like or how one should be, by the end of it, it sort of gravitates towards a more human understanding. And I'm not saying that I live like that, but I'm saying that I hope the world lives like that, and I get to sort of share the spoils. So, yeah, so that's how I see it.
Three small things. One is the part of Udupi I lived, they always called Radd, not Red. Yeah. So I'm a bit puzzled. Okay. Secondly, why was the book named Blue? And thirdly, did Bihar influence in writing the book?
So I'll start with the third and then move on to the first. Bihar didn't influence me because I'd written the book by the time I reached Bihar. And it's sort of been in the with publishers for 2 years now, and for 1.5 years before it finally got accepted. So if there's someone who's writing a book out there, be prepared to wait for a long time, especially if it's your first. Why is it called Blue? Because again, this is a rehearsed answer. Blue, 3 reasons. One, Rama in the traditional retellings of the epic, and if all of us grew up reading the Amar Chitra Katha version, he's always blue. So there's that one direct reference. The other is the fact that Redumone himself grows up next to the sea, and the sea is largely blue in color. And for a long time, as a child, and even now, I do spend a lot of time sort of staring at the skies, and I'm fascinated by look. And there's a lot of references to the sky. In fact, a little too much. And I hope my editor told me that if you write another book, you sort of focus on some other thing to sort of be your muse. But and the sky is largely blue. So these are the 3 main reasons. When I first wrote the book, the working title was A Perfect Blue, because at some point Redumone says, and the skies were a perfect blue. It really didn't go anywhere with the publishers. And then for whim, I changed it to Blue, and within 6 months there were publishers lining up. So I think the perfect was not the right word there. And as for Redder and Redder, it's true. But the thing was that I had a friend of mine who speaks Tulu, and I knew Reddu, but I didn't know Monet. And I'd asked him what the Tulu word for face was, and he said Monet. But when he wrote the word up, I had sent an email to him saying, "Can I call him Raddu dash?" He replied saying, "Yes, call him Reddu, REDDU, MONE." And I just kept the name like that, and therefore put it as REDDU. And now that's the way it is, and yeah.
Which part of Ramayana did you find easy to include in the book, and which part did you find it difficult to exclude?
Oh, okay. Okay. Easy to include, I definitely feel the first part of there are only 2 parts of the Ramayana that I directly deal with. That's the first part of the princes growing up. And I found that very easy to do because there's no material on that. You really don't know how Bharata or Shatrughna. You have some very little things, and there are lots of other Sanskrit scholars who've written about these characters and their own versions of the place, but there's no primary material on how these people were when they were growing up. So it sort of gives you a very free rein to your imagination, and that was sort of really helpful. The Kishkinda was more complex, and I really had to do a lot of reading before I said anything because I didn't want to mess up the flow of events in the original epic. I didn't want to say something that is in direct contradiction to what happened. If there's something I'm saying, it's always going to be like, hey, that was not there in the epic. But it's not going to be like, no, the epic says something exactly the opposite. And I try to keep at that. So that was and is there a part? I really wish I'd written about the banishing of Sita. I mean, given that I'd already written the 4th part, and the 4th part ends in a particular way, there was no way I could include Sita's banishment unless I'd sort of really tampered with the characters and how they end up and their arcs. And I didn't want to tamper with that. But I really want to go back. No, I don't think I want to go back. But if I had the choice in an alternate world, I would probably go back to writing just a version of the Banishing of Sita where, again, the hope is to not demonize Rama and to sort of, again, not make him a completely good guy, but to sort of present a more middle perspective on how it can be viewed.
So you were never tempted to do a Sita Sings the Blues?
That's a I'm just, no, never. Sita is actually a fascinating character. I sort of just let her be in the book as some ideal who one can't approach. Because I sort of started writing about her as the princess saw it. And I think when you're 17, 18, 19 and you see really pretty women, you sort of behave a certain way. And I was trying to capture that. So, but a more idealistic human version of capturing that way. So, yeah, tell me.
He's asking what happens at 25 when you see a pretty woman.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to say. You'll find out in the next book if there's one. So
yeah, someone else wants to ask. That was a very interesting. Someone else. Okay.
Do you know of a Sri Lankan version of the Ramayana?
Do I know of one? No, but I don't know what the Sri Lankan version is. But if you can tell us one, then I wouldn't mind. I mean, or at least talking to you after the launch and hearing it from you.
Are you replying to him, or we leave it there?
Thank you.
Well, I haven't read one. Told by a colleague of mine who teaches Sri Lankan that they have a totally different version in which Ravan is a great hero.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Ram is extremely boring. So, but from
which he is, even in our version of the epic.
You are not at all.
Yeah, no, I don't know. But even in our version, if some retellings, he's quite a boring person. He's too perfect to be a character sometimes. So.